afternoon, everybody. Pak Florian, thank you very much for your time and for your coming here. And I'm pleased to introduce you to Pak Florian Witt. He is the focal point on human rights affairs at the Delegation of the European Union in Jakarta. He is very knowledgeable on human rights issues, and this is the opportunity to discuss a bit about the issue related to human rights, especially regard to European Union policy on human rights. I wouldn't be very long. I just give it directly to you, but
thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I actually, you can all hear me, or should I use a microphone? Use a microphone? This one?
you can also.
Yeah. Okay. So it's better. Selamat siang. Great pleasure to be here. It's not my first time at UGM. I actually studied here about 15 years ago, a long time ago. I feel very old saying this. I spent a year here at UGM in Yogyakarta. I was studying Indonesian language, Bahasa Indonesia, but I also spent 2 semesters at FISIC, as it was called, learning about Indonesian politics and Indonesian history. So it's great to be back here, so thank you very much, Pak Mohadi, for the invitation. As Pak Mohadi said, I am working at the European Union Delegation in Jakarta. I work in the political section. Our day-to-day job is to follow your developments here in Indonesia, political developments in Indonesia, but also to manage relations with Indonesia. This includes with the government, but also with civil society, with universities, for example. So it's a fairly broad field, and this also includes human rights, and I am the human rights focal point at the EU delegation. That means I'm the port of call for any requests on human rights issues, but also for the contact point for human rights NGOs, Indonesian NGOs or European NGOs that are active here in Indonesia. So today I want to talk about the European human rights policy. A little bit about what the EU does on the human rights front, but also about our relations with Indonesia and how we cooperate with Indonesia on human rights and how we see the human rights situation here in Indonesia. So that's the outline. What is the EU? Just a few words. Are you all international studies students, international relations? No? Okay, so then probably I just start by explaining a little bit about the EU. Who knows what the EU is? Who can explain the EU to me? 2 sentences. You're not asked. So here you see a map of the EU, 28 countries, 500 million people, but of course it's more than that. But whenever you want to explain the EU, I like to go back a little bit to the Second World War, because if you talk about the European Union, you have also to see the Second World War, the devastation of the Second World War, and that the European Union grew out of the devastation of the Second World War with more than 40 million people dead. European economies, especially Germany, I myself am from Germany, in ruins. So there was a strong will in Europe to never let this happen again, something devastating as the Second World War. And there was a very simple idea, but a very visionary idea. And the idea was to cooperate. So to cooperate between countries that were former enemies and now they're actually working together. And this cooperation was done on 2 commodities, 2 important commodities of that time. It was coal and steel. So the Coal and Steel Union was formed, and this basically allowed the 6 countries, the 6 founding countries, to work together on this particular issue, and in the long run to make armed conflict within the EU something that is nowadays impossible. And if you look at Europe today, then I think it's fair to say that we have been quite successful in this, because within the EU territory we haven't had any war for the last 60, 70 years. Who knows the 6 founding members of the European Union? I mentioned already one. Germany. UK is actually not a founding member. The other founding members are Germany and France, Italy, and then the Benelux lenders, so Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg. These were the 6 founding members. But since the EU was very successful, it actually deepened its relations, its integration, but it also grew quite quickly. And if you look at this map, here you see color-coded the various enlargements of the European Union. So here you see in blue the founding members, and then the other countries that joined over time. A very important point in time was 2004, when 10 countries joined, and most of them were countries that belonged to the former Warsaw Pact, to the communist alliance in Europe. These are the slightly pinkish ones, so that's Poland, Czech Republic, Slovenia, also the Baltic countries. So that was a very important step. After the Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Republic crumbled. With these countries that belonged to the Warsaw Pact, they reformed and then later joined the European Union. So here you can all see it in one map. Since we're talking about human rights today, it's always important to underline the importance of human rights for the European Union and for the foundation of the European Union. This was put down in the so-called Copenhagen criteria. These are the criteria that, or the conditions that all countries who want to join the European Union have to fulfill. They're political criteria. That's first of all democracy, human rights, rule of law. Then you have economic criteria. You have to have a functioning market economy. And the third is the adoption of the acquis. That means you have to adopt all European legislation into your national legislation. That's a very lengthy process. That's why usually the process to become a member of the European Union is a process that takes 10 to 15 years, because you have to adapt your national legislation to the European legislation that is in line. So these are very important elements if you talk about the EU. So if you look at this in a way, you can say that the EU, although it's working on very technical issues and is working on economic integration, it's above all, it's actually a peace project. It was a way to create peace in Europe, and Europe has been a continent that basically has seen war for forever. And for the last 60 years since the EU has come into being, within Western Europe we have not seen any war. So I think it's fair to say it's a success. That's why also the European Union was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize 2 years ago. These are the treaties. I will just quickly skip through it. I don't want to bore you with too many details about the EU. These are the 3 key players. We have 3 main institutions in the EU. That's the European Parliament. That's the voice of the people, as it's here called. So that's a parliament that's elected all over Europe. You have the European Council. That's the voice of the member states, where the member states come together to set the general direction for the EU. And then you have the European Commission. And the European Commission is purely European institution, which is promoting the common interest of the EU. So you could roughly say European Parliament is the European citizen, the Council is the governments, and then the European Commission is the EU itself at EU level. There are of course other institutions. I will not go into detail. I will say a few words about the Court of Justice later, because it's also important for when we talk about human rights. And then, of course, this is my new boss. This is Federica Mogherini from Italy, and she is our High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security, and she is the boss of the External Action Service, European External Action Service. It's a new creation that was created under the Lisbon Treaty, and it is, you could say, it's a foreign ministry, the CAMLU of the European Union. So the role is to present the European Union at international level. A few major achievements. What has the EU actually achieved? The key achievement, the most important achievement, if you talk in technical terms beyond achieving peace, is certainly the single market. It's an incredible amount of freedom that European citizens enjoy within the borders of Europe. So the single market, what does it mean? That there are, within Europe, there are no borders when it comes to economic activities. So you don't have tariffs, for example, or export duties between European countries. It's one big single market, as if it was one big country of 500 million people. So, and this applies to goods, to services, to people, and also to capital. Why this is important? Most, of course, it's important for consumers. It's much more choice, but it also has created a lot of economic opportunities. It is estimated that it created at least 2.8 million jobs, probably even more. So this is one of the key achievements of the European Union internally, and it also gives the European Union a lot of power abroad. Because you have to imagine, if you are an Indonesian furniture seller, for example, and you want to sell your furniture to Europe, you don't have to go to Spain individually, to France individually, to Germany individually, and everywhere have to deal individually with the local regulations. No, it's one big market, so you enter the EU and then you can sell basically everywhere in the EU. But it's also for third countries, makes the EU very important, very attractive as one big single market. It's also freedom to move for citizens. So I, as a German, I can without problems settle down in Spain or in France if I want to. But it's also good for visitors to Europe, because we have the Schengen Agreement, which is not only Europe, it also includes Switzerland and Norway. And the Schengen Agreement means for you, if you have a visa to Europe, you go to France, and from there you can go to Germany, to Poland, and to Italy without actually having to ask for a new visa. So it's also for foreign visitors very convenient. Improving health and environment is also something that is very dear to the Europeans. Consumer protection, but also there are quite a few, it's a list of things that have been achieved in protecting the environment, but most importantly also protecting consumers. So this is EU law. That means that all of the EU countries actually have to apply these standards. So, coming back to human rights at home, in the EU. There are two key documents when we talk about human rights in Europe and in the EU. The first is the European Convention on Human Rights, and the second is the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. This can be a little bit confusing sometimes. I will explain quickly the differences. The European Convention on Human Rights is drafted by the Council of Europe. It was actually in 1950 in Rome, and it came into power in 1953. the Council of Europe is not an EU institution. It's actually international organization with I think 47 members. That also includes a lot of countries that are not in the EU. There's Azerbaijan, there's Russia, for example. And this already existed since 1949. And this Council of Europe drafted the European Convention on Human Rights, which includes a long list of rights and freedoms. There are in total 17 articles that cover a wide range of issues. I've listed them here. That's right to life, prohibition of torture, prohibition of slavery, right to liberty and security, and so on. You can see here the whole list. So that's the Council. That's the European Convention on Human Rights, which came into force in '53. And under this convention, the European Court of Human Rights was also established. This court has its seat in France, in Strasbourg, and it's an international court basically that was established under the convention, and it hears cases of perceived human rights breaches that are included in the Convention of Human Rights. Individuals can bring cases to this court, but it's also possible that a state can bring a case against another state to this court. There are some very concrete examples. For example, you might have all heard about the famous burqa ban in France. Who has heard about it? The burqa ban in France. Who's aware of it? You are. Okay, so actually burqa ban is a bit misleading, but the French government banned the covering of your face in public. This includes helmets, motorcycle helmets. It includes any kind of mask at a demonstration, for example. You're not allowed to cover your face at a demonstration. But it also includes the Islamic veil where your face is entirely veiled. And some citizens, some European citizens, French citizens, they saw this as a violation of their right of freedom of religion, to express their religion. They argued, for me, wearing the burqa is an expression of my religious beliefs. So they took this case to the European Court of Human Rights. So this is one possibility. If you as an individual think the state is violating my rights as outlined in the convention, you can actually bring this case to the court. The lady lost the case actually. The court argued that for public order it's allowed for the state to limit the right in certain circumstances. So she lost this case. And there are a lot of people who still argue that it's not right to ban the burqa, who say that it violates human rights, but they could brought it to the court and the court decided otherwise. So if you want to adopt it's law and has to be implemented this way now in France. Second, we have the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, and this charter only applies within the territory of the 28 European Union member states. So before we had the Council of Europe with 47 member states, and now we're only talking about the 28 member states of the European Union. The Charter of Fundamental Rights, it was drafted in the early 2000s, and it entered into force in 2009 with the Lisbon Treaty. This charter is nothing new because it brings together a lot of existing laws, European laws, but also United Nations Convention, etc. It just brings them together in one document. The idea behind it was that the European governments thought we want to make this issue of human rights, of fundamental freedoms more visible and spell it out more clearly. So that's why we put it into one charter that then applies to all, to the European Union level, but also to all the member states. So here you see it's 54 articles with 6 main areas. It's dignity. This includes right to life, death penalty. It includes prohibition of torture, etc. You have the freedoms, protection of personal data, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and so on. Equality, that's basically non-discrimination, that people should not be discriminated on religious grounds, on grounds of sexual orientation, or grounds of race, etc. Solidarity, that's basically workers' rights, prohibition of child labor, issues like this. Citizen rights, that's right to vote, right to stand as a candidate. And last but not least, it's justice. It's right to fair trial, presumption of innocence, etc. So what is important about this is that it applies to European law. So it's probably sometimes a bit misleading for a lot of people. It applies to EU institutions, this charter. So it applies to the European Commission, to the European Council, but it also applies to agencies or to other bodies like Europol, etc. What it means that these institutions, they have to follow all the articles, they have to conform with the articles as they are laid out in this in the EU Charter. It also applies to member states, so member states have to take this into account, but only if they are applying EU law. We are very complicated in the EU. So a practical example is if you're talking about trade policy, trade is managed at EU level. So this is actually where the authority lies with EU institutions, with the Commission. But of course, for example, in member states, say in the UK, they could actually, in the national parliament, pass a law about trade regulations, as long as it doesn't violate European law. They can do this, and if they do this, then they have to make sure that everything is in line with the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. But if they would pass a law that only touches on UK issues, say fox hunt, for example, then they would not have to take this into account. So that's just as an understanding. This EU Charter basically regulates and applies to EU institutions and to the implementation of European law. Europe has the Court of Justice. The Court of Justice upholds and interprets EU law. But now with the Charter on Fundamental Rights, this court also ensures that all the EU countries apply the EU law, and including the Charter, in the correct way and in the correct manner. Usually individuals cannot bring a case directly to the court. There are some possibilities, but usually they have to go to the national courts first, and the national court can then transfer a case to the European Court of Justice. I think it's only possible for an individual if to go to the ombudsman. We have an ombudsman for the EU. If they feel that an EU institution has violated my rights, then I would complain to the ombudsman. And there are some rare cases where they can go directly to the court, but I'm not an expert enough to explain this in detail. So this is all about our charters, our courts, but it's all very abstract, but EU actually also works to put this into practice. There are, of course, various ways we do this. I just wanted to highlight one particular institution, that's the Fundamental Rights Agency, FRA, as it's called. The role of the agency is to provide independent and evidence-based advice to European institutions, also to member states, on fundamental rights issues, on questions of fundamental rights. So it's an independent EU body, which is funded from the European Union's budget. And what they do largely is these three issues that I have highlighted here. As I said, they try to provide advice and expertise to EU institutions. One way by doing this is actually to doing large-scale surveys. If you go to the website, there are a lot of really interesting surveys on it. If you are interested in the issues of human rights in Europe, it's really some interesting surveys. For example, on discrimination of immigrants and ethnic minorities in Europe. There are still a lot of problems in Europe. For example, there's a Sinti and Roma, which are a minority that are discriminated against in many countries in Europe. Also a lot of immigrants to Europe feel discrimination. There's a large study about this. There's a study or a survey on gender-based violence against women, where they interviewed over 40,000 women with quite shocking results, actually, because it really brought to the public attention that violence against women is a serious issue also in Europe. That a lot of women in some countries, up to 30% of all women, are actually experiencing violence, have experienced violence in their life. There's an even larger study on lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender hate crime discrimination, where they interviewed over 90,000 LGBT people in Europe. So why is this important? Because everybody says, oh, we have to protect the rights of the LGBT people. But then if you ask, so what are actually the key problems, nobody knows. So such a study is really important as a basis. Also on anti-Semitism, they interviewed over 6,000 Jewish people, also with quite shocking results, that anti-Semitism is still an issue after all, although we don't like to hear it, but it is the case now, unfortunately. Comparative legal social research on hate crime, children injustice, very current, up-to-date topic, the rights of migrants to Europe, political participation of people with disabilities. So these are studies and researches they do as well. And then last but not least, handbooks for legal practitioners, which is very practical advice for lawyers, etc., on various issues. So this was just a short overview of the human rights policy at home in the European Union. Just to give you an overview, not to say that we are perfect or we don't have any issues. I already mentioned a few issues. So there's actually a lot of work that we also have still to do at home. Nevertheless, since human rights is so important for the European Union, and it's a core principle of the European Union, democracy and human rights, the European Union believes strongly that it also has to promote human rights in its relations with third countries. It has to promote human rights basically across the globe, everywhere. We strongly believe that sustainable peace, that development, that equality can only be achieved if you guarantee human rights of the individuals. This is a strong belief. But how do we do it? How does it look in principle? How do we promote not European rights, human rights, universal European rights, human rights abroad? I put together some examples. First of all, this handsome guy, it's Stavros Lambrinidis. He's from Greece. He's a former member of European Parliament. He's also a former foreign minister of Greece. Very eloquent, very good guy. And he has been appointed as the special representative, as the European Union special representative on human rights. What is his role? It's basically to give a face, to give a European face to the promotion of human rights. So he is traveling all over the globe, talking to government representatives, talking to civil society, talking to academics on various human rights issues. He has a small team. They then also pushing at home, working with the European Parliament, pushing governments at home to do more of this, to do more of that. So he has a quite, he's very active, and he plays a very important role in promoting human rights abroad. He has been to Indonesia twice. Mainly he also met Indonesian interlocutors, but he was mainly working with ASEAN on promoting human rights within an ASEAN framework. So he meets regularly with the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, ICHR, to help them in promoting human rights within ASEAN, drafting papers, etc. So he has been here twice. I'm sure he will come back in the very near future as well. Another tool that is at our disposal are the so-called EU human rights guidelines. These are very important for people like me who are sitting in, working, not only sitting, sometimes we stand. Like here we are working in delegations abroad in third countries, and our role is to work on human rights, to promote human rights, to work with local partners on human rights issues. That's of course, it depends very much on the various countries where you are. Here in Indonesia, we are very free to work. We can meet whoever we want to meet. We can support NGOs with very little interference from the government. Now, if you go to Vietnam, for example, this already looks completely different. A colleague of mine has told me he was talking to human rights defenders. Next week they're sitting in jail, so it's a very, very different approach. So these guidelines, as I say, they provide us with guidelines on how to implement, how to do our work. These guidelines are not legally binding, so they're not a legal product per se, but they have been approved by at ministerial level in Europe, so it's a strong signal that these issues are priorities for the European Union abroad. Today we have 11 guidelines. I've listed all of them here. Some are very important for us here in Indonesia, others less. We try to translate them all into Bahasa Indonesia so that it's all accessible, also accessible for NGOs here to probably serve as an inspiration, but also to let them know what they can expect from us. And how do we implement these guidelines? There are several options. We are, of course, at the EU delegation, we are a diplomatic representation. We are basically like any other embassies, just that we don't represent the country, but the European Union. But it means you have to play also by the rules. So how we promote human rights is, it can be through public statements, through public activities, exhibitions, etc. It can be through démarches. A démarche is an official representation where we, usually with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where we ask for a meeting and then put forward a specific issue and probably ask Indonesia to do this or do that, or ask for cooperation, etc. That's an official démarche. We can issue statements, public statements. We have done so after the recent executions in Indonesia, where our High Representative issued statements basically expressing disappointment about the executions. So these are the tools that we have on the diplomatic front. These are the European guidelines. Then we have the human rights dialogue. The EU holds regular dialogues with over 40 countries. Indonesia is one of them. This dialogue is usually between government to government, so it does not involve civil society. It means it's our senior officials meeting with usually KEMRU, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also Ministry for Law and Human Rights, etc. So it's purely government to government at senior official level. It's held at an annual basis. The agenda is agreed jointly, so we both decide what issues we want to discuss about. So it means that the issues are decided on a case-by-case basis. Of course, we have certain priorities, be it the death penalty, be it prevention of torture, but it's always decided jointly with the other country. These are the human rights dialogue. The meetings rotate, so one year they take place here and another year in Brussels, in Europe. I say a few words more later on our dialogue with Indonesia. And then, last but not least, as one of our main tools, this is more on the development side, it's less political. This is the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, EIDHR as it's called. And this is an instrument where the European Union provides funding to usually civil society organizations working on human rights. And this is quite a lot of money that the EU puts into this. So you can see here for a 7-year period, 2014 to 2020, it's 1.3 billion. Don't ask me how much that is in rupees. It's 20 zeros. It's somewhere trillions, I think. But it's quite a lot of money. With some key areas, it's torture, it's promoting democracy, it's on the abolition of the death penalty, but it's also economic and social rights, international justice, then non-discrimination, be it LGBT, women, children, minority groups, and then electoral observation. This is something very specific that the European Union does, where we, with the agreement of the host country, of course, send fairly large-scale missions to a country to observe elections. Usually we do this in countries in transition, where the integrity and the credibility of an election is very important to guarantee peaceful election and transfer of power. For example, here in Indonesia, we had a big mission in '99, the first democratic elections after the fall of Suharto, and also in 2004, where we had the first direct election, direct presidential elections. So there we had, I think, over 250 observers here in Indonesia, all over the country, and then later issuing a report. In the case of Indonesia, a very positive report that said that there was free and fair elections and very well managed. So it was actually a strong endorsement for Indonesian elections. And this is positive, of course, for a country like Indonesia that is transforming into a democratic country, because you have basically international stamp of approval that your elections were well managed and were democratic. So that's why the Indonesian government also agreed to host us for these observation missions. The last one was 2006 in Aceh, because of the role the European Union played in the Aceh peace process. And then we had the first elections for governor after the end of the conflict, and there the Indonesian government also invited us to observe the elections. Again, is a very positive result. Let me say a few words about EU-Indonesia relations and specifically about the role of human rights in these relations. Before I talk about details, probably just to take a step back, we always say Indonesia is a very important partner for the European Union. Why is this the case? Why do we think that Indonesia is important? And if you look at it, there are several reasons. And a key reason is, I was talking a lot about values and core beliefs in the European Union. I was talking about democracy, human rights, the importance of international law, regional integration. These are all values that Indonesia shares with us. You are a democracy, you're actually the third largest democracy in the world. You have strong institutions in place to protect human rights. You have signed the major international conventions. And you promote human rights and democracy beyond your own borders. In ASEAN, for example, you have the Bali Democracy Forum, so even further than only ASEAN. Indonesia was key in promoting the ASEAN Human Rights Charter, for example. So that's why we see Indonesia as a very important role in the region and actually shares a lot of the values with us. So we think it's a natural partner for us. Of course, there's the size. Indonesia is a massive country, fourth largest country in the world, third largest democracy, largest Muslim majority country in the world. Within ASEAN, you are half of ASEAN, so you are, without you, nothing moves in ASEAN, basically. Don't tell us Malaysians I said so. But so naturally, again, for us, a very important partner, just by the size, beyond the values. And then why we in Europe are very impressed with Indonesia is because you have managed a very successful transition from an authoritarian regime that you had in place for over 30 years, something like for over 40 years if you take the end of the Sukarno period. Authoritarian regime, you have managed a largely peaceful transformation, and you have combined this with fairly impressive growth, economic growth. So I think this is an excellent example to a lot of authoritarian regimes that argue well, you can only have development or economic growth with a strong fist, and democracy doesn't work in our countries. I think Indonesia is actually an example that it can work, and a very impressive and important example. So in many ways, Indonesia is a key country in the region, but increasingly also globally. When we are talking about climate change, for example, you cannot talk about climate change without having Indonesia on the table. You have some of the largest forest areas in the world, and unfortunately also some of the highest deforestation rates, but whatever that is the case, it means that if we want to talk about climate change, we need Indonesia as a partner. So these are all elements that underline why we think Indonesia is a really important partner for the European Union. Our relations are fairly broad. I don't want to talk about the whole range of our relations. It would probably go a bit too far. But it's certainly it's trade, it's on economic matters, it's on investment, it's climate change I've mentioned, it's on democracy, it's peace and security, it's now increasingly also on issues like migration, for example. So it's a fairly wide range of activities and interests that we share. And one of it is also human rights, so the human rights dimensions of the EU-Indonesia relations. I've just listed 5 issues that I quickly want to mention before I come to an end, and then I hope we can discuss a little bit more in detail. I'm very happy to questions. So, the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, PCA, this was ratified and entered into force last year. It's an agreement between EU and Indonesia. It's actually the first agreement of this kind that the EU has signed with a Southeast Asian country. And this provides a framework for our cooperation. It's very wide-ranging. It's kind of our former ambassador called it a Christmas tree because you have everything on it there. It's a lot of different issues. But it provides a framework for our cooperation, be it on trade, be it on countering drugs or terrorism, or being on very technical issues like intellectual property rights. So it's really a very wide range. And what is very important is that this PCA, this cooperation agreement, also has human rights provisions in it, where we both pledge to cooperate on human rights and promote human rights jointly and in our territories. So that's an important element of this PCA, and it underlines, I think, the importance the EU and also the Indonesian government attaches to promotion and protection of human rights. The human rights dialogue, the annual human rights dialogue, that's certainly one of the key activities that we have when we talk about human rights. It keeps us very busy every year because preparing this is a major nightmare, preparing all the briefings on the thousands of different topics. It was launched in 2010, so until now we had 5 sessions, either here in Jakarta or in Brussels. As I said earlier, it's a government-to-government exercise. Usually our counterpart is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, usually at director level, director for human rights and for UN issues. He's our counterpart. We always consult civil society before the meeting. Since civil society is not allowed to sit at the table, we consult them before and we ask them for input. What do you think, which are important issues that we should raise? They can provide input in terms of data, reports, etc. So we do this here in Jakarta with Indonesian NGOs, civil society, but we also do this in Brussels with the large global NGOs like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, etc. that have partners all over the world. So what do we do in this dialogue? It has several elements to it. First of all, it's about cooperation. I was talking earlier about the shared values that we see Indonesia is doing well on human rights, with institutions in place and relevant conventions, etc. ratified. So our key point is to identify areas where we can cooperate. This can be that Indonesia, for example, says, look, we want to improve our laws for the protection of women rights, for example. It's just something I make up. And where we can say, okay, in the EU we actually have a lot of legislation on this, we have a lot of experience on this, we send someone over, or we organize a few meetings, workshops where we can exchange experiences. This is one element where we can cooperate. But it's also cooperation at the global stage, international stages, for example at the UN, where we cooperate on maybe identify where do we have similar positions, or where do we have positions that are close, can we come together, can we unify our point of view, can we probably vote with a similar vote on certain issues. Usually Indonesia doesn't like to vote on country-specific resolutions because it has to do with intervention into domestic affairs, etc., which Indonesia is very sensitive to. So usually if we support a resolution on human rights violations in Sri Lanka, for example, and you would like Indonesia to vote on us, so we talked about that. These are our reasons. Do you agree? Do you want to vote? And Indonesia says, no, we usually don't do this. Sometimes they do. On Syria, actually, they did. There was a bit of an exception. So this is where we try to find common ground on some issues in multilateral fora, like the UN, for example. And then, of course, human rights dialogue is also an opportunity for us, but also for Indonesia to raise concerns that we have about human rights in Indonesia. And there are a few that I will mention later. But also for Indonesia to raise concerns, human rights concerns they see in Europe. Islamophobia is, for example, an issue that comes up on a regular basis. Where Indonesia says you are not doing enough to integrate or protect the Muslim minorities, which we have about 20 million now in Europe, 20 million Muslims in Europe. And so this is an issue that the Indonesians raise with us. Where then there's an opportunity to actually engage in a dialogue to probably clarify misperceptions, to clarify other issues, etc. Another important element is UPR exercise. I don't know if you are aware of the UPR exercise, the Universal Periodic Review. Who has heard about this before? One person. What is the UPR? Yes, it's within the UN. It's basically peer review mechanisms where one country is reviewed by the other countries, and this is still fairly new. I think they started in 2010 with this exercise, so it's still fairly recent. I don't recall the exact date. But Indonesia has been reviewed already 2 times. It was actually the first batch of countries that was reviewed. And there's a long list of issues that are raised, and with other countries issuing recommendations. And this is not only then, as it's very often portrayed, the West lecturing other countries, but it's actually countries like Mexico or Namibia or African Middle Eastern countries who say, well, what about the protection of Ahmadis in Indonesia, for example? And we would recommend that you do ABC. So there's a long list of recommendations. I think in the case of Indonesia it was over 100. And then it's up to the country to accept these recommendations or to not accept the recommendations. And what we always do in our human rights dialogues is to look, in preparation, we again look at these recommendations. And then of course we ask the country, so how are you working with this? What are you doing to implement these recommendations? Is there a way we could help? So this is also an important element of our human rights dialogue. As I said, we had 5 dialogues so far. In general, it was a very open and constructive exchange and discussions with Indonesia. So I think it also makes it important for us to have a specific approach to the individual country. We always argue with our colleagues in Brussels that you cannot treat Indonesia like you treat China. Indonesia is much more democratic and much more advanced in the protection of human rights, for example. So that's why I said the focus is more on cooperation in this human rights dialogue. Of course, with the possibility to also raise concerns, as I mentioned earlier. The regular coordination of priorities in the UN, I already mentioned it. The UN, the European Union's human rights policy is also translated into actions at the UN, at the Third Committee or at the UN General Assembly, etc. So that's in terms of resolutions, etc. So this is where we always coordinate very closely also with international partners and also with Indonesia. So we see Indonesia, I would think, at least 3-4 times a year to discuss our various positions on issues in the Human Rights Council or in UNGA, and to see if we can find a common ground there. Cooperation with civil society, very important for us. We consult civil society on a regular basis. Not only NGOs, also academics, also other organizations. Nahdlatul Ulama, for example, is also an organization we cooperate quite closely with. When we discuss freedom of religion, when we discuss tolerance, these issues, and we also consult NU. This is very important for us to support civil society, but also to listen to them. And fortunately in Indonesia we have a very active civil society, also very free and active media, so this is very helpful for us in our work. And last but not least, before I stop, funding under the EU, European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. As I mentioned earlier, this is a funding opportunity for Indonesian NGOs to work on human rights issues on a few priorities. Usually per year, for Indonesia only, we have about €1 million available. So this is only for Indonesia. The key issues for the EU-Indonesia when we talk about human rights, unfortunately, in the last couple of weeks and months, we had to talk a lot about the death penalty. The EU has a very clear position on the death penalty. We are opposed to the death penalty in all circumstances. We consider the death penalty cruel, violation of human rights, and we also think that it's not effective. It's not effective to prevent crime or to deter crime. The death penalty is abolished in all European Union member states, and this is an issue that is very dear to the European Union. So, as Indonesia is an important partner, we were quite disappointed with the executions in January and now in April. And we also issued a few statements about this. This is one issue that is very important for the EU when we talk about human rights in Indonesia. I'm happy to discuss this. I hope we can discuss this actually. I know that in Indonesia, I don't know if there has been a proper survey. I saw a survey done recently by Indobarometer. I think the result was a bit perplexing, I must say. I think it was for drug crimes, 88% supported the death penalty, or 86%. For murder, it was 50% who supported the death penalty. And for cases of terrorism, only 2%. So we were all a bit like, why is this the case? This is very strange to us. But so I'm very happy to discuss this. I think the majority of Indonesians supports the death penalty, but we are always happy to put forward our arguments. It's not about intervention, of course. I think the debate got very emotional in Indonesia, and a lot of people and politicians accused foreign governments and countries of intervening in Indonesian affairs. This is not what we're trying to do. It's more that we try to put forward arguments why we consider the death penalty is not appropriate and not effective. But maybe we can discuss it later. We'd be very happy to hear your views about it. Torture prevention. That's also a key priority for us. There was a report by the there by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on torture, Manfred Novak at that time. He visited Indonesia. I forgot the exact year, it was 2008. And his conclusion was that torture happens in Indonesia, very often in police facilities, and that there are not enough safeguards. So this is where we try to first promote or lobby Indonesia to ratify the optional protocol for the Convention Against Torture. Indonesia has ratified the Convention Against Torture. That's good. We would hope that Indonesia also ratifies the optional protocol, which then includes additional safeguards and also a national preventive mechanism, which would, for example, include visits, unannounced visits to prisons, police facilities, etc. This is something that we work on with Komnas HAM and these institutions. Non-discrimination is another big issue that we are working on. This is freedom of religion. Can be discrimination of religious minority groups. We have also discussed in the past the rights of people with disabilities. There's actually very good work done here in Georgia by some NGOs that are trying to promote local regulations that would take into account the rights of people with disabilities on very basic matters. Crossing the streets, if you've been to Europe, usually it's very friendly for people with disabilities that if you have a wheelchair you can enter almost everywhere, so these are issues they also promote. And then of course we also have discrimination against LGBT persons, or LGBTI I think is the latest correct. Women's rights, in particular violence against women. There actually Indonesia is doing very well. It's still an issue, but as I said earlier, in Europe it's also a big issue. So it's something where we actually want to talk to Indonesia. Are there lessons learned? For example, Indonesia has a domestic violence law that actually outlaws any form of violence at home, any gender-based violence. And last but not least, international instruments. This is usually the code for the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court, where we also ask Indonesia to join, where Indonesia has a few reservations, but this is a process that is ongoing. So, probably as my last point, where do we look for advice from Indonesia? This is usually when it comes to tolerance, and when it comes to the living together of various religions. This is something, I think, where Europe can learn from Indonesia. As you can see, Indonesia has a very long and proud history of tolerance, of 5 and even more religions living together, and generally in a very peaceful way. Whereas in Europe, where we basically have been Christians, Protestants and Catholics, but the majority Christians, and where we struggle with the influx of minorities that are non-Christian minorities, largely Muslim minorities. So I think there's a point to be made that in some areas, Indonesians are more tolerant when it comes to dealing with other religions than Europeans are. In Europe, of course, we have very strong legal safeguards. So if you feel you are discriminated against, you go to the court. You can try to fight for your right in the court. Whereas Indonesia has a different approach to it. It's a kind of softer approach. It's more of a built-in society approach where you don't take these issues to court, but you probably go to the local EU chapter and to bring together the heads of the local church, and you sit together and you try to discuss it and deal with it and come to a conclusion. So very different approaches from the one in Europe, but something where I think Europe can learn from Indonesia, probably the other way around as well. So I just wanted to add this, so not to give you the impression that we are trying to impose our thoughts, beliefs on Indonesia, trying to lecture, that it should be a two-way dialogue in an ideal world. Okay, I will stop here. I will very happy take your questions on whatever you want to talk about. Whatever.
Thank you very much, Florian. I think I start to open the floor for questions. Please mention your name and your background. One more. Yes. Okay. Please don't forget to mention your name.
My name is from International Relations. As you mentioned in your presentation, that there are some problems that you usually face in implementing various prevention in the home level, such as the discrimination that's still experienced by a minority group in the member states. I would like to ask about what you can do, or how far actually you can control or manage or make sure that the EU laws or policies on human rights is implemented well in the member states. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Melanie from International Relations Department. I want to ask, how does actually the EU deal with national law that has different standing point towards certain human rights issues, like in Indonesia, for example, and what kind of action that possibly can be done to the government of that state?
Yeah. Sorry, can you repeat? You mean with third countries?
Yes, with a country like Indonesia, for example.
Yeah. So if there is, if we consider as flagrant violation of human rights in a third country, what the EU can actually do.
My name is Oka. I would like to ask a question. What does EU suggest to Indonesia as an alternative of that penalty? For example, if I'm not mistaken, in Portugal, they regard addiction as a disease rather than form of crime. But here in Indonesia, we might not have done such a research to declare addiction as a disease rather than crime. So I would like to know what does the EU suggest to Indonesia concerning that penalty for that kind of stuff.
Not a very easy question to answer, but I try to.
No. Well, thank you very much. Very good questions. None of them straightforward to answer, I'm afraid. Well, I will try. So, first of all, what the EU can do to implement the human rights provisions at home, in particular if you face issues like discrimination against minority groups. Well, I think I outlined all the legal elements earlier. So most of the legal provisions are actually there to prevent discrimination. In some areas, the EU and its member states have been quite successful in limiting discrimination. For example, when it comes to gender-based discrimination. If you, for example, look at the number of women in politics or the average salary of women as compared to men, it's still lower than men, so it's not perfect. You can clearly still see that there is a certain degree of discrimination, but it's actually much, much lower than in many other countries. And this is through a range of actions and of policies that try to prevent discrimination in the working place, for example. So when it comes to pregnant women, for example, It can be very simple things, like in a job interview, you're not allowed to ask a female applicant if she's pregnant or not. Because this could then lead an employer to say, oh, she's pregnant, she's going to be on leave very soon, it's going to be very expensive, I'm not hiring her. So these are, for example, these elements, very practical elements. The EU has especially a lot of regulations that apply for the workplace, for hiring people, for firing people, how you select people. Because this is something where we can actually do a lot with laws and EU law and regulations. In other areas, of course, it's more difficult. In the day-to-day area, it's more difficult to prevent discrimination. So that's then the question of raising awareness. I mentioned the Fundamental Rights Agency earlier. That's why I think the research they do is very important. Just to also raise awareness. I give you an example. I mentioned Islamophobia earlier. Europeans don't like to hear, but it actually is an issue that there are Europeans who have a problem with Muslims coming to Europe for various reasons. Then you have press reports about issues that imply that Muslims are not integrating into society. I give you an example from Germany. I come from Germany. In Germany, in school, you have sports. It usually includes swimming. So we had a case in Germany where the children were taken to swimming lessons. There was one family, a Muslim family, where dad said, no, because of religion, he will not allow his daughter to join the swimming lessons because it's against their religious beliefs, etc. And there have been a few other cases. And this has been reported in the press, and this has been pretty much blown out of proportion, that the common wisdom was like, a lot of Muslims don't want to integrate, they don't want to send their children to swimming lessons. Yeah, the girls, the female children. But then there was a study where they actually asked parents and teachers, and actually the number of Muslims who don't send their children to swimming lessons is 2%. Yeah. So it means another 98% don't have a problem with it. So it means the majority of Muslims actually integrate just fine. Yeah. So these are issues that are very often reported in the press. A lot of people believe it, which then leads to these silly movements like you have in Germany. European hatreds against Islamization of Europe and stuff like this, which is usually right-wing movements. But this feeds it. So I think then awareness raising, having good research, getting actually facts out there is one way to approach discrimination at a society level. It's probably more difficult to reach with rules and laws and regulations, the discrimination on a day-to-day basis. I think it's very important to have the proper facts if you talk about these issues. For example, in Europe, if you ask a lot of people how many Muslims live in Europe, they have completely wrong numbers. They say like 50 million, like 10% of all Europeans. It's not true, it's 20 million. So these numbers are very often completely overblown, which just shows that there's a lack of information if you talk about these issues. Another issue is the discrimination of Sinti and Roma, which is an ethnic minority that they usually called the gypsies in Europe. And this is the group, the ethnic minority that's probably most discriminated against in Europe. And this is not only in the countries of origin in Eastern Europe, but it's also in France and other countries. So it's actually quite quite shocking if you hear about it. Because the thing is, a lot of people just don't know about it. So it's very important to have these studies and to raise the awareness of these issues. I think the legal safeguards that we have in Europe are pretty solid. They're pretty good. As I said, if you as an individual, you feel you are discriminated against, you can take it to a court. Some people even take it to the European Court of Justice. And there you have opportunities, or you have an ombudsman, etc. There are a lot of opportunities to address these issues. But it is more based on the individual rights perspective. So you as an individual, you actually have to fight for your rights. Unless there are some NGOs, some civil rights groups that take on issues. So in short, I think the legal safeguards that we have are quite good. They're not perfect, but overall they're quite good. I think where we have to work more is integration of minorities, especially of Muslim minorities, into the mainstream. And mainstream is more work into the European majorities. But there has not been done enough, and there actually the state can do something, can support this. And then it's getting more information, getting better information, better data on these issues to actually know what you are talking about. Because a lot of people don't know what they talk about, because they talk about these issues in Europe, unfortunately. What are possible EU actions to address violations abroad? Well, that's a tricky issue. We cannot intervene in a third country, of course. If Indonesia wants to execute people, we cannot stop Indonesia from doing so. What we can do is a diplomatic approach. That means through the usual diplomatic channels you can lobby for certain things. You can have a public approach through public statements, public awareness campaigns, etc. These are the things you can do. Beyond this, of course, there's always the option of sanctions. But usually sanctions are only applied in really serious cases. And only in cases where you have a critical mass of countries that support your sanctions. One example here in the region is Myanmar, that had a pretty horrible military regime for several decades, where the EU, but not only the EU, but a lot of other countries as well, actually imposed trade sanctions. There is a lot of debate how useful sanctions are. Some people, or most people, argue that sanctions can only be successful in specific cases, and only if you apply short-term. Long-term sanctions usually don't really work, but it's one of the tools that you have to really punish, if you want to put it this way, the country. Beyond public naming, shaming, sanctions are the way to go. Of course, if a country has signed international conventions, the relevant UN conventions, you will always remind the country of its obligation to actually implement and adhere to these conventions. This can be on various issues. This is another tool we have. I think the most blunt and brutal tool is probably the sanctions, and this is applied very, very rarely. So it's more about finding ways to cooperate and trying to push the country around and tell the country what to do. It's more to put forward arguments and see how we can cooperate to jointly work on some of these issues. Of course, there are some cases that are pretty much hopeless. North Korea or something. It's very difficult to find areas for cooperation. Alternative to the death penalty. Now that's a very good question. objects to the death penalty based on several reasons. One of the reasons is that we believe it's actually a violation of human rights. But there are also studies, quite a few studies actually, that show that the death penalty is not effective to deter crime. Some proponents of the death penalty argue that there are no studies that show that it's not active, that it's not effective to not deter crime, the other way around. But it's very clear there are some studies, especially in the US, on murder cases. Having a death penalty, the murder rates stay the same. Actually, in some states that don't apply the death penalty, murder rates are lower. I don't know if there's a direct relation between the two things, but it's a fact if you read up on it. So I think this must be, beyond the human rights arguments, the key argument must be, it's just not effective. Killing people, it's not effective. It's not going to help a country in any way to address this issue. Another issue is that in every legal system, no legal system is perfect. So there are mistakes to happen in every legal system. Look at the US. I mean, there have been so many cases recently where a person who spent 30 years in jail was found because of new technologies, DNA, samples, new evidence, where it was actually found that this person was innocent. And he spent 30 years in jail. It's already bad enough. Imagine he would have been executed. I mean, now at least you can release him, and he gets I think $2 million from the state, and at least bad enough, but at least he can live the rest of his life. If he's executed, it's too late. It's irreversible. You cannot change it anymore. And as I said, no legal system is perfect. And I think the Indonesian legal system is not perfect. I think probably most of you would agree about this. So that's why we think it's wrong to use the death penalty. There's just nothing good coming from it. So what are the alternatives? I think it depends very much on how you see what is the reason to put someone in jail or to punish a person. Is it to punish him, or is it to turn him into a better person and to reintegrate him into society? And I think the common idea is to reintegrate a person into society. Actually, in Indonesia, the prison is called menyelenggarakan, which implies he's put in there and then he comes back into the masyarakat and is a good citizen, a good warga. So I think the Indonesian logic to some extent is similar, that you actually don't want to punish someone just because he committed a crime, but actually you punish him with the goal to rehabilitate him and to turn him into a better citizen. You certainly don't achieve this by killing him. So the alternatives are obviously prison sentences. We should have the possibility for very severe cases of life imprisonment. I think nobody argues against it. And then, of course, it depends on what issues you talk about. All of the executions that took place in Indonesia in the last month, all 11 people that were killed were drug traffickers. So we're talking about drugs. The president argued that there's a drug emergency, that there are 40 to 50 people dying every day. Some people say the data is a bit dodgy, but whatever the exact data is, we don't want to belittle the drug problem, because drugs are a serious problem. Here in Indonesia, but also in Europe. I mean, we have our own experiences with it. Look at the United States, for example. they have serious issues with it. And they had a decade-long war on drugs. They called it the war on drugs. And it just, all it created was death and more crime. So actually now the US is also moving away from this pure law enforcement suppressive approach regime. You mentioned Portugal. This is actually a very, very good example of alternative approaches. A lot of examples have shown that if you treat drugs as a health issue, that you have the best success rates to actually address the issues. So that means drug users are not criminalized. They are basically they are people who suffer from a health issue. So you rehabilitate them, you put them into rehabilitation. The best successes are if you rehabilitate them in community-based initiatives. So not by putting them into a clinic and lock the door, which is similar to a prison, but in communities. That has proved to be the most effective. A health issue, harm reduction, what it's usually called. So you try to reduce the harm that drugs do. You try to address the side of demand. So you don't try to suppress the suppliers, but you work also on the demand side. You look at issues, why do people take drugs? And the Netherlands are actually a really fascinating example because they decriminalized and later also legalized some drugs. And drug consumption has actually gone down. So it's quite some interesting examples. So this is the latest data and studies on drug issues. They all show if you treat drugs as a health issue, you have best chances to reduce the impact of drugs. And then you work on the demand side. And then you also work on law enforcement. And then you can also work on drug traffickers. But what you should not do, most studies show, is that you try to punish the low-level drug mules. If you look at some of the people who were executed here in Indonesia, I mean, they were basically poor people, some of them from Africa, the Filipina lady, who were really poor people, and they were trafficking the drugs, so they did commit a crime of carrying the drugs, but they were not top-level drug dealers or drug kingpins. So punishing these people is ineffective, because you will always find another poor person who is willing to risk his life for a few big bucks. So the successes, the data shows that the best success is actually if you try to attack the middle management team. So not the top guys, because this leads to massive drug gang warfare, not the low-level guys, because these are not effective. So most effective is the middle rank of the drug cartels. You can decriminalize drug use, which is done in a lot of European countries. Like if you carry some drugs and you're caught by the police, you're not punished for it. If you can convince police and prosecutors that you are using it for yourself and you're not dealing, you go unpunished. So this is decriminalizing drug use, which is sometimes done legally, sometimes more on a pragmatic basis, depends. And then of course you have legalization of drugs. And as a liberal person, I must say there are good arguments to legalize drugs. Because the state has control over drugs. The argument is there will always be people who want to use drugs. You cannot stop them. It's like there always will be people who smoke, although it kills you. Everybody knows smoking kills you. I stopped smoking 10 years ago, I'm very happy about it. So There will always be drug users. Maybe they even have a right to use drugs. Who knows? So if you approach it from this side and say there will always people who use it, rather than giving it to criminal gangs, let the state take care of it. Let the state control it. It's of course it's not an easy issue because there are moral considerations, a lot of considerations, and I mean there's no country in the world, to my knowledge, that has legalized hard drugs, for example. Yeah. But there are some countries that legalize even marijuana, for example. Yeah. Often the states where you can buy it now for, in some states you can buy it for medical reasons, medical reasons. I think this is one approach some countries should consider more carefully. We can tax it, we even make money from it. So there are some arguments. But as I said, it's a difficult, not difficult, but you have to discuss it very carefully because it also has moral considerations, and there's no approach that works everywhere the same, so there's no one-size-fits-all approach. I think every country has made up its own mind how it wants to deal with these issues. But I think there are a lot of alternatives to the death penalty. I'm pretty sure that if you will look at the data available for Indonesia, that if you look at the drug problem, the data we have is very poor, so I think there has to be done more research on it. But I'm sure if you look at it, a lot of the drugs are actually produced in country. So it's not the drug traffickers that have been executed are only like a small part of the problem, because a lot of most of the drugs that are taken are amphetamines, like chemical drugs that are produced in country. And then, of course, I'm pretty sure that if you look probably at the data in a year or two, you will see that the institutions have not reduced drug consumption or drug death. I'm pretty certain. So very long, winded answer, but I wanted to give different angles to it. But in short, there are a lot of different approaches to it, and it's up to every country to pick what they think is best.
Great, thank you, Florian. Is there anyone? Could you limit the question very short? Yeah. We are running out of time. Please do it very short.
Alright, thank you very much for the opportunity. So my name is Reno. I'm from International Relations Department, and I'm really interested about your presentation. It is very, really nice and really covering all the aspects of the human rights. That,
thank you. You're my favorite people in the audience.
And I am really highlighting the points of migrants and also the refugee. The first one about the migrants, because for example, take the case from the France, the leaders, Sarkozy and Holland. I don't know how to say his name. Holland. Yeah. Because in Sarkozy, migrants have no, let's say, get the press by the government, but in Holland, the right is there for them. So, does you also consider the future of your political? Does they consider the political future of EU by the next decade if they give the rights to the migrants, for example, like that? So that's my first question. And the second thing is about the refugee. How do you accommodating the issue of refugee, in the case of Rohingya, for example, because we have seen just videos, many people from they are escaping from the country, they are fleeing from the countries in the boat. So, for example, Thailand, Malaysia, they don't want to take care of them. They don't want to protect them because probably for some reason. But how do you play an approach to this situation? So because basically Indonesia is a very big country, and we can also influence our country that mostly in the region, in ASEAN, we don't also have the ASEAN Human Rights Convention. So how?
Thank you very much. Yes.
My question is related to the European Union policy for human rights. So the question is, what is the European Union policy for human rights violation in Indonesia, where it took place in several places like Papua, Aceh, and former province of Indonesia, East Timor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Untitled Chapter. I'm from France as well. And I just want to ask one question. As I know from my professor that European Convention on Human Rights has this margin of appreciation mechanism. And how does this mechanism work in EU? And contradict it with the UK thesis right now with the ECHR itself.
Thank you. Very good questions. Your question first? I don't know. To be quite honest. I'm a political scientist. I'm not an economist. I haven't studied law, so I'm afraid my knowledge doesn't go so deep. I can try to ring up a law professor in Europe if you want. No, quite honestly, I can't answer the question. It's too detailed on the legal finer points of the European law that I'm afraid I can't answer. So, very sorry. The rise of migrants in Europe. I think this is an issue where more needs to be done. Where there's a lot of debate going on various issues. How many migrants do you take in? How do you distribute them between the countries? What about social services you provide? What are their rights, etc. I think this is work in progress to a large degree. So I'm afraid that this is an area where, yeah, as I said, work in progress, where the EU is still discussing a lot of issues, and where you have different points of views between different member states. It's not always the case that we are called the European Union, that we're always united on all issues. We have a lot of different positions and thoughts on various issues. Of course, the issue of illegal migration, undocumented migration, refugees, it's an issue that Europe is struggling with right now. I guess you're all aware of the tragedies that have happened in the Mediterranean, with ships of refugees with hundreds of people on it that actually sank. On one ship, over 800, close to 800 people died. And these are refugees from African countries, usually. They start from Libya. Since Libya is, well, you could almost call it a war zone, a pretty lawless area these days. Thanks to also the intervention of not at least the EU. So I think it's a great example of how intervention in a foreign country can backfire pretty badly. Because before the Italians and the Europeans basically had an agreement that, well, you stop the refugees and you buy oil, etc. And now that you have pretty much chaos in Libya with with different factions fighting each other, it's pretty much a lawless zone where you have these people, traffickers and smugglers, that use it as a hub, and it's incredibly well organized. It's crazy. There are 10,000s of people waiting for taking a boat to Europe. It's incredible. And this is an issue that has long been ignored by a lot of the member states out of fear that they will have to take on too many refugees. And right now it's basically Italy and Greece to some extent that have to take on most of the refugees. Basically Italy, most of them. So the proposal from the European Commission, actually, so from the EU level, and that does not take into consideration the interests of the individual member states, but the whole of the EU, is actually proposing to distribute refugees by a quota. I don't know exactly how the quota will work, I guess depending on economic capability and number of population, etc. But basically to distribute them. But this was met with a lot of resistance from some countries. UK, for example. My country, Germany, is guilty as well. So it's a tricky issue where the EU is not fully living up to its own high standards, I must say so, sadly. Where we have to do more. I think after these last tragedies with hundreds of dead, we're doing more. So the German Navy, for example, is now also sending boats to the Mediterranean to police the waters, to rescue people in danger, etc. To not only leave it to the Italians. There are now plans for intervention in Libya to address the problem already in Libya. The people, smugglers and traffickers, probably even a military intervention, but this of course it also needs support from the UN, so how this will work, we have to see. But it's something that the EU has to do more. So when we then talk about the Rohingya, here in Southeast Asia now, I think the EU has to be very careful what it says. Because we have our own problems at home and we're not doing so well. But of course the situation of the Rohingya is really, really, really horrible. If you look at these cases, there are up to 10,000 people, I think, who are at sea, who are in danger of either starving or drowning or whatever, and they are pushed back by the Thais, and then by the Malaysians, and then by the TNI as well. So this is a very, very, very dire situation. So I think there it's really important what the EU is good at, to bring the region together and to find a solution. I think this is what ASEAN also should do. And so far we have seen not enough from ASEAN, I think. So this is where the ASEAN countries need to come together and really see how can we address the situation. You can't leave it to only Indonesia or to only the Philippines to take on all the refugees. It also has to involve Myanmar. Myanmar is discriminating against the Rohingya in a pretty horrible way. So they have to talk about it if they want to or not. So I think there ASEAN has to do more. And of course we would appeal to the countries to, if people are in danger, to take them on, not just push them out and see again. But as I said, from the EU right now, we have to be careful. We don't want to comment on this publicly because we have our own problems at home, and we don't want to be, don't want to preach here what we don't do at home. I think this would be hypocritical. Last but not least, EU policy, past human rights abuses in Aceh, Papua, Timor-Leste. Well, we always argue for solving past human rights violations, either in a court. Indonesia has a possibility of a human rights court, USIS, or through a TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think there are several ways. We, as the EU, we cannot tell Indonesia how to deal with it. Indonesia has to find its own way to deal with it. But we think it should be dealt with. Because as you mentioned, there are actually quite a few. It's Aceh, it's Papua, Timor-Leste, where tens of thousands of people died. You also have 65, 66. You have 98. You have Kazakhstan. You have quite a few incidents. Then where you actually have recommendations from the Komnas HAM, from the Human Rights Commission. You have reports, you have recommendations, even from Parliament, which is with always the Attorney General. So our suggestion would be to Indonesia, we would encourage Indonesia to continue this, to take up these cases, up to Indonesia, how they want to do it, setting up a court or a TRC or whatever. This is not for us to decide, it's for Indonesia to decide, but we definitely encourage Indonesia to deal with this. Personally speaking, as a German, one of our history lessons is we are responsible for some of the worst crimes in human history. The Second World War and the Holocaust and the murder of tens of millions of people, especially the Jewish population. This is the responsibility of the Germans. And German people have said this should never happen again. And one way to prevent this from happening again is to be as transparent as possible about it, to really open everything up, to make everything available to the public of what happened. So it's, in Germany it's taught in school at least 2 or 3 times. Nazi regime, Second World War, Holocaust, etc. Lots of movies everywhere. So this teaching the next generation of what happened so that it doesn't happen again is, I think, one of the lessons that the Germans learned, which we would recommend other countries to do as well. But it's of course up to the individual countries. The Japanese, for example, have done it differently. So the Turkey still says that there was no genocide in the Albanians. So it's a different issue. But just personally speaking, as a German, I think dealing with the past of the country in open and honest ways.
Okay, thank you very much, Florian. I don't think we need to extend anymore because we have been discussing for 2 hours.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much.
But we are very happy to have you here, and I think you will be also the lively discussion of the forum, and hope to see you again next time.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.